So hopefully today we get to solve our mystery, which is how come out of all of the forbidden mixtures, which are crossbreeding animals, grafting plants, mixing meat and milk, and mixing shatnez, wool and linen, shatnez is the only one that has a permissible option. And that is either in tzitzis, where you're allowed to have wool and linen together, or in the Kohanim's uniform, where you have to have wool and linen together in the belt. So we're just trying to understand why it is, what would make such a stark difference between that mixture and the other mixtures. We also spoke about the idea that the reason you can't mix certain things is because they represent different kinds of spiritual energies, and those energies can't mix. And that's when you have a bad chemical compound and there's going to be some kind of an explosion or some kind of spiritual fallout, which left us with a question that normally it's a good thing to bring things together. Harmony and peace are usually values in Judaism. Now suddenly you say, no, but don't mix these things because it's going to be bad. Well, I thought that's the whole point, is that you're supposed to mix things together. So to answer that, there are two things that we're going to have to understand. The one is an halakhic concept. Another is a practical appreciation of what happens when you mix things together. So the halakhic concept, which we learn in the laws of kashrus, is that there's a difference when you mix two things that come from the same species versus when you mix two things that are from different species. So in the language of halacha, we call it min beminoi. You're mixing like with like, versus min b'she'enoi minoi, when you're mixing something with something which is unlike it. Now, needless to say, you're going to have greater conflict when you're trying to mix two things that are not alike than you'll have if you're trying to mix things that are alike. So let's try and understand what that means. Let's say that a person had milk that came from a kosher animal and that milk that came from a non-kosher animal, and then they're mixed together. So you say, well, that's min b'minoi. This is milk and this is milk. So it's going to behave in a particular way where you can expect that they're going to mix up completely. On the other hand, if I have a chunk of meat that falls into a bowl of milk, well, then it's two separate entities, and obviously they're going to mix differently. So that's part of our conversation over here. We have to try and understand if these forbidden mixtures that we've described, is there ever a scenario that they could actually be, even though they're so different, could they actually be min beminoi, the same type of entity? That's the first thing we're going to have to try and understand. Second thing we're going to have to understand is what happens practically when two different forces collide, or when two different things mix. Let's try and understand what are the possibilities. There's basically two options of what could happen when two opposite forces collide. So the one thing that could happen is that the one force is stronger than the other force, and so it overwhelms the other force. So let's say, for argument's sake, a good example of this is in the Earth's surface. If you have two tectonic plates that collide, one of them is going to lift up over the other. So it's just going to depend on which is the stronger. Or if you take an object and you throw it against the wall, so it's going to depend what kind of an object it is, that will determine either the object's going to break or the wall's going to break, right? So that's one type of collision where the dominant or the stronger one is going to overwhelm the lesser one. It's one possibility. Then there is another possibility, which is that they're both strong, they're both dominant. So what happens when you have two forces where both of them are dominant and they collide together? Now what are you going to get?
Destruction.
You're going to get destruction. You're going to get destruction. That's what's going to happen. That's where you get an explosion, because you've got so much force and nowhere for the force to go because neither side is giving way. So the whole thing basically explodes. So those are the two factors that we have to consider when we're trying to understand the difference of what happens when you mix things together that represent two very different spiritual energies, two powerful spiritual energies. What could happen? So now let's try and pack that or plug that back in to the scenarios that we've spoken about. The Torah tells us in this week's parasha that you may not plow with an ox and a donkey together. And the reason for that, we said, is because ultimately you're not allowed to crossbreed those two creatures. So there you have it. Are they both the same species? The donkey and the ox? Definitely not. Definitely not the same species, of course. The next question is, what's the result going to be? In other words, is the result, if I crossbreed the ox and the donkey, is the result going to be an explosion, Or is the result going to be that one of the species is going to get obliterated? Because that's the one version, right? Where there's a very powerful force that hits another force, and then one of them loses their identity. So which one's going to happen in the case of crossbreeding? Is it going to be an explosion, or is it going to be a loss of a species? It's a loss of a species. In fact, in the case of crossbreeding, and we've already spoken about this, as the Ramban pointed out, that's exactly the problem. In fact, it's not the loss of a species, it's actually going to be the loss of both species. So this is more like when you take two fragile items and you throw them at each other and they both break. That's what's going to happen over here. So it's not possible to have a positive outcome, because any time where something breaks, any time where something loses its identity, that's never going to be a positive outcome. So this is the extreme. The extreme is the example of crossbreeding. And we say in the example of crossbreeding, you can never have a positive outcome. Therefore, you can never, under any circumstances, mix the two of them together. Doesn't matter if you want to say it's for a mitzvah. It's irrelevant. Because ultimately what's going to happen is something's breaking. Not only is it breaking, it's disintegrating completely. The species is disappearing, both in the sense that the resulting animal is neither a horse nor is it a donkey, and, as we've already learned, the fact that it's unable to have further offspring. So that tells you that this is the end of a species. So the Torah will never endorse something that's going to result in destruction. Can't be. So therefore it's going to be off the charts, off the table, never allowed under any circumstances. The same kind of thing is going to happen with grafting, even though with the grafting of two species of plants, it's not as dramatic. It's not that the new species is going to be unable to propagate necessarily, but the fact is that you are destroying the original species. The outcome is going to be something different to the original species, so it's the same principle. What you're doing over here is you're obliterating something, and that can never be endorsed by the Torah, so it's not even a conversation, not even a discussion. Okay? On the other hand, as we've already identified, when you take shatnez, you take wool and linen, and you put them together, so neither of them is going to disappear. The wool is not going to be any less wool, the linen is not going to be any less linen, even if they are stitched together, even if they remain together in that garment for the rest of time. Doesn't matter. The wool will still be wool, and the linen will still be linen. So the problem that we're dealing with over there is not the problem of obliteration. It's not the problem of destroying something. Nothing's getting destroyed. But yet, the Torah has told me I'm not allowed to put the two of them together. So now you've got to ask yourself, well, why not? If nobody's getting hurt in the process, what's the problem? So, what's the problem? We've already identified the problem. We said the problem, which is right across the board of all of the forbidden mixtures, is that you can't take two opposite energies and try and accommodate them in the same place. It's not going to work. It's kind of the equivalent of trying to pull in two opposite directions. So it's just not going to work. Nobody's going to move. You know, that very old, before there was such a thing as memes on social media, sometimes you used to have these pictures that people used in, like in presentations or whatever, and occasionally they'd get passed around. So you might remember there was that I guess you could call it a meme, about cooperation with the two donkeys. You know, where the two donkeys, there's hay on either side, and they're both pulling to try to get to the hay, and of course neither donkey can eat. And it's only when they realize that you've got to both go eat from this bundle, and then you've got to both go eat from that bundle, then you can work together. So it's that kind of concept, right? When you've got two opposite energies, it's literally like pulling with equal force in opposite directions. Nothing's going to move. It's going to be completely unproductive. It's an unhealthy mixture. So the reason you can't mix the wool and the linen has nothing to do with destruction. It's just the fact that they don't work. They don't work together. Now, I think everybody will agree that wool and linen are different species. Because remember, we said there's two possibilities. Either it's things which are of the same species or things that are different species. So I think everybody will agree that wool and linen are different species. Right? Except there is a difference with wool and linen that is not going to apply to the other mixtures. You see, when we say that two things are the same species, of course, what we mean is you look at the properties, the molecular structure of wool and of linen, completely different. You look at where wool and linen come from, totally different. Linen is a plant-based product, wool comes from an animal, completely different. Obviously, from our perspective, looking at things through a physical lens, they are as different as you could be. But there is another concept of being the same or different species. And again, here maybe the English fails us a little bit, because the word min could also just translate as a type rather than a species per se. So it's possible to have things that are completely different and yet actually are the same type. For example, let's say that you are running a business. In your business, you have somebody who is in charge of marketing, and you have somebody who is in charge of accounts. Those two usually don't get along, right? Similar to your, Hotnik and Hartz and Hotnik and Kop kind of concept, right? They often don't get along for the reason that the marketing needs to spend a lot of budget in order to market, and accounts feels they don't yet have that budget. And you've got this pull-push, where they say, yeah, but you have to market in order to get clients, in order to have budget. And so it goes. So would you say that they are two different species, the accountant and the creative? Are they two different species? Absolutely. They're completely different species, right? They're completely different species. They think differently. They read the world differently. They have different priorities. They're completely different species. However, let's say that your business is that you sell shoelaces. And across the road from you is a guy who sells cufflinks. Now, you've got a marketing guy and you've got an accountant, and he's got a marketing guy and he's got an accountant. So, if I'm inside the business, then I see the difference between the marketing guy and the accountant. But if I'm looking at my business compared to his business, we're all one type of people. We're all the shoelace people. Yes, these are the marketing people of the shoelace company, and these are the accountants of the shoelace company. But we're all focused on the same goal. We all care about the same success. We're all working for the same brand. So actually, we're all in the same min. We're all in the same type, even though we're very different in what we do in that space. Which means that if the marketing guy and the accountant would live with absolute clarity that we are both equally responsible for the success of this business, they would not be knocking heads anymore. They'd find a way to work together because they're working for the greater good. And generally speaking, that is when, because we've spoken about the idea that it's always ideal to bring opposing forces together and to get them to work in harmony, well, that's when it can happen. When there is a higher ideal, when there's a shared goal of something that's bigger than the both of us. So, a great example of that is, going back to something we mentioned right at the beginning, when the Torah tells us, Oiseh Shalom Bimroimov, that Hashem makes peace on high, the Gemara says, what's that referring to? Michael Sar Shamayim, that the angel Michael is the angel of water, and Gavriel Sar Shalesh, the angel Gavriel is the angel of fire. And by rights, they should cancel each other out, or at least one should overwhelm the other. But when Hashem gives them a role to play, now they're working for a higher purpose, it's no longer about them. And they experience something which we call bittul. Bittul is where you put your own interests aside for the sake of what you're supposed to be doing. So the Gemara goes on to say that in the plagues in Egypt, when the plague of hail happened, it was a paradoxical plague. It was an impossible plague because you had ice with fire. How did that happen? That is Oiseh Shalom Bimroimov. That's because in that context, ice, which is represented by the angel Michael, and fire, which is represented by the angel Gavriel, have to put their differences aside because there's a mission to do for Hashem. So when you're focused on doing what Hashem wants, it's no longer about you. You could take very different and even opposing energies, you could put them together, and they could not only coexist, they can actually complement each other. That's the ultimate state. The ultimate state is they could complement each other. So, when we look at kilayim, otherwise known as shatnez, which is the mixture of wool and linen, and we notice that the Torah says there's a conflict over here, and that conflict cannot reside in the same space. You can't have the wool and the linen representing chesed and gevurah, these very different energies. You just can't have them in the same place. It's going to be completely counterproductive. That is true. That is absolutely true. So long as you're in a context, which is a normal context, where the wool feels like wool and the linen feels like linen. In other words, the chesed is pushing for a chesed agenda, and the gevurah is pushing for a gevurah agenda, and they just cannot see eye to eye. Therefore, under ordinary circumstances, you could never put the two of them together. However, if the circumstances change, and now we're talking about a mitzvah, a mitzvah is different. A mitzvah is not self-serving. A mitzvah is not me setting my agenda versus you setting your agenda, and let's see if we could compromise, or if we could collaborate, or whatever the case is. A mitzvah is we're all working for the same boss. We are all supposed to surrender our personal needs in favor of Hashem's expectations. So in the context of a mitzvah, there is no longer a clash of those energies. There is now a harmonizing of those energies. So it's Oiseh Shalom Bimroimov. This is now in Hashem's space. In Hashem's space, we don't have the same limitations. We don't have the same constraints that we'd have in our own environment. And so it is possible that the wool and the linen can live together happily. When? If it's tzitzis. Because tzitzis, it's not for personal use. Tzitzis are there to serve Hashem. So when I'm there in the service of Hashem, we're all on the same team. We're all working towards the same goal. We all lose our egos, and therefore we could live together. Now, if that's the case in tzitzis, which is an ordinary mitzvah, it is certainly the case in the Kohanim's uniform, because the only time a Kohen could wear that uniform, not only when he's doing what Hashem wants, but doing it in the holiest place, because he was not permitted to wear that uniform outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So not only are you now aligned with what Hashem wants, but you're in the place where you experience Hashem's presence and Hashem's will in a very visceral way. So obviously there can be no conflict. In Hashem's space, there's no room for conflict. So now, not only is it okay to mix wool and linen together, you've got to do it, because any opportunity that we have to bring opposite energies into harmony, we have to take that opportunity. That's how we're supposed to live. So any time that we can create peace where previously there was conflict, we have to invest effort to do that. So that's why in that space, you've got to mix the two of them together. Now, by the same argument, why can't I do that with crossbreeding, grafting, or meat and milk? Maybe because the Beis HaMikdash is such a holy place, we should have cheeseburgers in the Beis HaMikdash because it's a conflict area, and we've already seen that if you're able to bring conflicted pieces together, that's the ultimate. So why not do it in those circumstances? So for that, we've got to go back to our original point, which is, depends what the result will be. There are two possibilities of what happens when you bring two opposing energies together. The one possibility is both energies preserve their identity. That's why it's explosive. What if both energies are preserving their identity? You can create harmony between them if you have enough power. So in the wool and the linen, the wool is still going to remain wool and the linen is still going to remain linen. So if the environment is powerful enough, elevated enough, holy enough, non-egotistic, then I could pull the two of them together and have a positive outcome. But the other kinds of mixtures that we've described, there will always be one dominating the other, or they both lose their identity. So in the case of crossbreeding, they're both going to lose their identity. The result is going to be destruction. You can never work positively with destruction, even in Hashem's home, which is a really important lesson, right? Even if you're in the Beis HaMikdash, in the service of God, doing the holiest things, doesn't matter. If the result is going to be destruction, it can never be kosher, can never be good. Not only that, in the case of meat and milk, which we already identified was some kind of a middle ground between the two extremes, in the case of meat and milk, what's always going to happen is one will dominate the other. There'll either be a flavor of meat now in your milk dish, or there'll be a flavor of milk now in the meat item. Something's going to dominate. So it's still the same problem. The problem is, if I can't allow each side to preserve their identity, then I can't pretend to harmonize them. You can't harmonize something if it's losing itself. That's why those other kinds of mixtures never have an opportunity to be brought together, even in the holiest of spaces. Now that has obviously a really important lesson for us. In fact, maybe a series of lessons for us. The first is that you have to anticipate in life that there will always be points of conflict. That's the way Hashem designed the world. There's always some level of friction, and we shouldn't panic about that, because we've just got to understand the context. So the context is, if I see somebody who is very different, maybe they irritate me, maybe we don't get along, and I want to try and repair that, I want to try and be able to create harmony, which is the ultimate goal. The Gemara tells us that that the only reason Hashem gave the Torah was to bring peace into the world, like we saw in the video last night. All right, the only reason Hashem gave the Torah is to bring peace into the world. So therefore, if I see that there's a place of conflict, specifically between people, the way to resolve that conflict is, I've got to get those two people into a state of higher purpose. If you're both working to serve Hashem, you have a better chance of overcoming the conflict than if you're both working to try and edge your way into a better position. So a great example of that would be the concept of, because here you got the word again, shalom bayis. Shalom bayis, unfortunately, conventional wisdom always advises couples that the way towards peace is you've got to compromise. Compromise is where somebody's got to lose. That's like trying to take the milk and the meat. One of them is going to dominate. That cannot be a kosher mixture. Compromise is not a kosher mixture. So what is a kosher mixture? Educating a couple that what you're doing over here is you're trying to serve Hashem. It's not about who's right, who's wrong, who's got the dominant hand. It's about trying to serve Hashem. And if you're trying to serve Hashem, then you've got to get the egos out of the way. When you get the egos out of the way, then you have the opportunity to create harmony and to be able to have shalom. Equally, there's another lesson, a really important lesson. And that is, unfortunately, there are often people who live in a holy environment, because that's what we've been speaking about, living in the Beis HaMikdash, doing what Hashem wants. So often you have people who live in a holy environment, and in that holy environment, they feel, because I'm in a holy environment, therefore I have the rights to dominate somebody else. Therefore I have the rights to be able to say, I'm right, you're wrong, you're not from enough, you're not holy enough, you're not learning enough, or whatever the case is, because I'm the custodian of holiness. Well, guess what? That's the lesson. Even in the holiest place, it's not kosher. It's not acceptable. It has no space in Hashem's environment where one either dominates or cancels the other. So if the result of my frumness is the demeaning or discrediting of somebody else, it's not holy, it's not kosher, doesn't belong in Hashem's space.